super excited to have a conversation with Tudor Dixon, who is the gubernatorial candidate, who I think far and away the best candidate. And I'm excited to have a chat about your run here and what things look like. So one of the things, Tudor, that we have in common is we both have 4 daughters, which I think is it's awesome because girls are great. And I'm curious though, with 4 daughters and a busy life, what made you decide that a run for governor was really the thing to do?
Well, 4 daughters is really a big part of it, right? Because we saw what was happening with our kids during COVID. And then when you dig a little bit deeper into the state of Michigan, you see that the education system in Michigan has really fallen quite far in the past 20 years. So we used to be in the top 10 in the nation, and now we're 38th in the nation, but headed quickly toward the bottom 5. So we're on course to be in the bottom 5 in 2030. And that is what we want to reverse. So that comes first and foremost is taking care of education. And that's really my inspiration is my own children and seeing what they're going through in school. But then when you look at what else is happening in the state, I want my kids to stay here. I want my kids to have a place to work, and I want my kids to be able to thrive here in the state of Michigan. And right now, businesses aren't thriving. They're really being attacked by government. They're being pushed out. They're being fined. They're being cited. And the middle class is really kind of leaving the state saying, this isn't the best place for us. The schools are not good enough. We're starting to get more dangerous cities. It's expensive to live here. The future is not bright under this administration. So I said, well, what can we do? Let's see if we can change that.
I love it. And it's, when you think about what Michigan was at one point, I mean, Oakland County was the second wealthiest county in the entire United States, not that long ago. I mean, it's been a few years, but certainly we have the resources, right? One of the things that I saw a little bit of commentary about, it's a sad state of affairs. The latest thing in Texas with the shooting is just horrific. And so I know, in terms of the school piece, right, keeping our kids safe is the #1 thing we can do. I live in Lake Orion, and the Oxford shooting is literally a couple miles from my house. And one of the kids that was killed, unfortunately, worked at our golf course. So I knew him, and it's devastating. And yet I just don't think, from what I've seen, that Whitmer and her crew really know how to solve that issue. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what would you do to help improve that situation? Because it's not good.
Well, we've seen a plan come out from the state police here in the state of Michigan in 2018 that said this is a great plan to try to protect our kids, a multifaceted plan. That, first and foremost, I think we need to go through and say what has been implemented. And at this point, I don't see that much has been implemented from that plan. So let's take a look at that. Let's sit down with the people that know how best to protect us, and that is our police, and say, what do you think we need to do? But also, let's look at some other states who have experienced this. In Florida, after the Parkland shooting, they went through and they said, okay, we're going to harden our schools. No more soft targets. No more places where people know they can go and there's not going to be any protection for the students. We need to figure out how to make sure our schools are safe and our children are protected. And that's really something that we need to focus on. And it really is very key for my campaign. As you said, I have 4 kids. Every day when I drop them off, I think about their safety. I think every parent now thinks about their safety. We have to have realistic measures that can ensure that our children in the school are safe.
Yeah, it's crazy to me. I mean, if you look at the Biden administration, they just sent $40 billion to Ukraine. There's now talk about the United States being on the hook for financially covering at least a big chunk of the cost of rebuilding Ukraine. And yet we can't figure out how to, think about what $40 billion would do to protect our schools, right? What we could do with that money. I think it's something like $500,000 per school could be put back into it if we weren't sending money overseas like that. It just seems like the Democrats have a twisted sort of relationship with the American people. Their policies to me don't make a lot of sense. I'm curious from an economic standpoint, some of your perspective here, because I look at Michigan, it's one of the greatest states. I mean, we have amazing natural resources. We have really smart people. It is one of the greatest states that you could possibly live in. And yet we lost, 1 million jobs during COVID. We have a brain drain from people, leaving the state because of these policies. And Any thoughts on what you can do to kind of stem the tide on that?
Yeah, if you look at how state government is treating businesses, you're talking about jobs lost and businesses that are not thriving. Well, they're not thriving under the Whitmer administration, and they won't thrive under the Whitmer administration, because no matter where I go, northern Michigan, if I'm on the west side, the east side, the UP, every company that I talk to says they're being hammered by state government. State government is coming in and they're giving them citations, fines, there's new taxes, there's new regulations. It's the same guidance, but interpreted differently. So they have agencies that, like environmental agency, licensing agencies, going into our businesses, our existing businesses, and saying, oh, we have to cite you for this. We can't give you a permit for that. Permit to get permits to build is going out 8 months rather than the traditional 1 or 2 months. This is really crushing business. So we can go in pretty quickly and say, okay, what's working in other states, but what worked even in our state before Gretchen Whitmer came into office? Because we had a economy that was going up, that was thriving in ways under Governor Snyder, and now has been crushed under Governor Whitmer, mostly because of overregulation and these agencies that are going in and crushing business. So we change out agency heads. We change that culture of wanting to get you. I mean, we right now in Michigan are known as a gotcha state, where the government is going into our different businesses and saying, gotcha here, got you with a fine, got you with a citation. That does not create a desire to stay here, expand here, or come here if you are a business outside of the state. In fact, it has more people leaving than we've ever seen before. We used to have 19 congressmen, now we have 13. And that's where we really struggle, is this loss of population. The state of Michigan has got to bring back a working class so that we can thrive. And right now, people look at the state of Michigan and they say, well, your schools are failing, your cities are not safe, and your taxes are high. We're not going to move there. We're going to move to one of the surrounding states. We have to pull from that workforce and bring them back to Michigan, but we have to be willing to offer them what they need, and that is safety and good public schools.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about that. And I appreciate your perspective, because as I own a business, as you know, um, and the regulatory landscape has gotten silly. Anytime that you stifle innovation, you stifle new business, you come in with a we're on the other side kind of attitude. It doesn't really kind of build that synergy that you need. The state can be responsible for growth. They don't want to be inhibiting growth, right? It's common sense. And when you look at what happened during the pandemic, I mean, it was ludicrous to me that we could be allowed to walk down certain aisles in Home Depot, but not in others, right? That we were shut down for as long as we were. I mean, you look at the playbook as to how to screw up an economy. Whitmer, she could have written it, right? So I'm curious, I'm certain that there are people that would love to see us kind of extend this pandemic, right? Or maybe even come up with a new variation. So if we find ourselves in a difficult situation where you're confronted with some of these challenges, what would you do differently under pandemic scenario that Whitmer did? Because I have a feeling it'd be very, very different.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we saw what happened in states that didn't do what she did and they thrived. But let's take a look at what did happen here. She came out and she said she's going to put COVID positive patients back into nursing homes. And we now know that she had guidance from professionals, including the nursing homes, saying, whatever you do, do not put COVID patients into nursing homes. It's the worst possible case scenario that you can enact. And yet she did. She took COVID patients, put them into nursing homes. Now think of how bizarre this is, because my grandmother was in a nursing home. I had a negative test. My grandmother had a negative test. We were kept from each other. We couldn't see each other. But somebody who was COVID positive could go into a nursing home. This is how outrageous it was. And we lost people that we shouldn't have lost. And that needs to be investigated. Unemployment, a massive amount of people on the unemployment rolls that shouldn't have been on the unemployment rolls. We ended up with somewhere between $8 and $12 billion that went out to people that shouldn't have. That's our money that was lost because of irresponsibility in the state. And then you look at the schools. We see other states where students are thriving. The mental health rates are much better. We have a problem in the state of Michigan. We've had suicides. We have kids that are depressed. We have kids that are severely developmentally and educationally behind. This is what we should be looking at and saying, how do we hold this administration accountable for what they did? But also, I mean, you talked about going to the grocery store and being able to buy food, but not potting soil. Think about this. You could go to the abortion clinic, but not the cancer clinic. What about all of those people? There were irrational decisions made that made no sense whatsoever. These were political decisions that were made. And when you look at a situation like this, if you're playing political games, you don't deserve to be in a position of leadership, because this was cutting everybody else out, cutting all branches of government out. She wasn't going to work with the legislature. She was going to make these decisions on her own, even though she campaigned on being the most transparent governor who was going to work with the legislature because she'd been there. Complete opposite of that. And this was catastrophic for the state of Michigan. Like I said, when it comes to economy, we're not bouncing back. Safety, we're not bouncing back. Education, we're not bouncing back. We've got to get this administration out so we have a chance at getting back to where we need to be.
Yeah, it's crazy to me. I'm not sure that the average voter knew how crazy politically left the trio is, right? Dana Nessel, Jocelyn Benson, and Gretchen Whitmer. I mean, the damage that they've done, it's just unbelievable. And you go back to the schools, and I completely agree. I think the damage we did by making the kids wear masks for as long as we did, and making them stay at home, and all these other things, it's really set our kids back. My daughter's now, my youngest one is a senior in high school. And she went for 18 months, like socially isolated, and she was depressed, and there's and on top of that, what you run into now, all these kids are on medications, right? That they probably didn't need. It was more situational. And it's really frustrating. I guess, one of the things that, as a mom and someone who's lived here and really cares about Michigan, I think this is really important, because politics has become so divisive. And what we've learned, from when Trump was president, I think his policies were great, but his personality was a challenge, right? I think we would agree to some degree on that. And so when you look at how you lead, what could you do if there was anything where you could try to find some middle ground, right? So if a Democrat or someone even that's a little bit more progressive, right, there's got to be some common ground that we can all agree on, so that you have a better chance of governing from the middle, where I think most people are in Michigan.
Well, how can you argue with making decisions that are best for people rather than best for one particular person's career, right? A political decision.
Right.
So, I mean, that is really what our campaign is based on, is going out and saying, we want a family-friendly Michigan. This is going to be the best case scenario for everybody in your family. We're going to make sure that our schools are great and that parents get to make the decisions. No more the Democrats posting, where did parents get this idea that they belong in the schools? No, we believe parents belong in the schools, because our kids have been through a tragedy. And in many cases, they're not over this, but parents know where they are better than teachers. So we need to have parents involved, especially now, to make sure our kids get back on track. But also here, we're going to make sure that your cities are safer. Our focus is to make sure that we have safe cities in the state of Michigan. And I don't see how anybody can argue with that, but also making sure that it is the best place for regular folks to live, that we're not in the top 10 in the nation for taxes on the middle class, that we can reduce some of the cost to live here, put more money back into the pockets of the people of the state, and make sure there are jobs here. But then if you are a small business owner, and that is all you've done in your life is pour all your entire life savings into something, that this is the best place to have that business. But I've had people come to me and say, oh, we were so lucky during the pandemic because we had savings. So we were able to pour our savings into our business to keep it open, and we saved it. But think about that. You were robbed of your entire savings because you were shut down while the state next door wasn't. Your neighboring businesses, your competitors, were not shut down because they didn't have unreasonable political decisions going on in your state. This is outrageous. So I think that when you ask about how will people look at this and say, this is the best place to go, I mean, really, how much worse could you do than what we've experienced under the Whitmer administration? We're offering something for families. This is just a personal decision based on her career.
Yeah, I think she's in over her head. She's quite the political animal, but she might be a good politician, but she's a terrible leader. And it's been really frustrating, as you know. I mean, I've witnessed the greatest wealth transfer I've ever seen. When you look at, during the pandemic, you could go into Costco, shop, and you could sit down and eat at a restaurant, but the local restaurants were all put out of business, right? Walmart's, they did great. Amazon, they did great. The local yoga studio, I mean, think about it from the standpoint of, what did we need to do to stay healthy? We needed to exercise. We needed to take care of our
Right.
bodies. We needed to have that mind body connection, and all that got shut down. And
State
it was,
parks were shut down. I think people forget that state parks were shut down. You couldn't go out hiking. When people talk about our students and our children being depressed, I have to tell people from other states, you got to understand, our kids were out of school. They weren't allowed to even play outside in the neighborhood. It was like you had people policing the neighborhoods to make sure the kids from different families weren't getting together. My 10-year-old, she was 10 at the time, looked at me and said, "Mom, I think this is what depression feels like." It was the first time in their lives they weren't allowed to leave the house. They weren't allowed to play in the neighborhood, and you couldn't even go to the grocery store with them, because if you took, there was one point where you could take one person with you to a store, but you couldn't go out anywhere. They weren't going out to see the world. They were trapped in the homes. So you look back at this time and our kids were just terrified. They had no idea why they were trapped in the houses, and there was no hope for them. They had no vision of what the future would be. They had no light at the end of the tunnel, because nobody knew what the administration was going to do. It was really very cruel.
well, and I think that's a great word, Tudor, cruel, because I think in the postmortem analysis, we can look back and say there was no scientific evidence behind most of the decisions that they made. And they knew this. Okay. They knew this early on. And yet they continued to push for emergency powers. They circumvented the Supreme Court by going to the health department to enforce laws that shouldn't have been enforced in the first place. I mean, it became very clear that this wasn't about the health and safety of our kids. I mean, the damage that they've done, I mean, they should be in jail, not
Well,
running.
remember, the chief executive or the chief medical executive of the state, when asked, how did you decide when we should be locked down and when not? She said, I was just a small portion of that decision. Well, wait a minute. You're in charge of everything that has to do with infectious disease and making these decisions. But that, to me, is saying, well, there was political science involved as well, because if it wasn't fully up to me, if I can't tell you why we made these decisions based on the medical advice to the citizens of the state of Michigan, then it must have been a decision made based on political science from people saying, gosh, there's an election coming up, we've got to stay in step with the Biden administration. Remember, Gretchen Whitmer was out there auditioning to be vice president, and she was all over the news back then. Do you see her all over the news now?
Not yet, but wait till they get to a place where Biden is not removed, but he won't run a second term. I think that's pretty clear. And I think they want to throw Gavin Newsom up there, and they have Whitmer as their person. I don't know. Hopefully she'll be unemployed come November. That would be awesome. And I know you got. I just have one last question, and this is a personal question because you're one of the most likable people that I've met, and you're really throwing yourself into a tough spot. They're vicious. The left will do anything and everything to stay in power. I know you're tough. You're a survivor, right? And I know you care about your family. I know you love Michigan, but you're putting yourself in the crosshairs of one of the more evil political machines that I've ever seen. And so, number one, I wish you good luck, and I'm gonna do everything I can to help support your cause. But I'm just curious, like deep down inside, what you're in for, right? And so what's the number one driving thing that's going to get you through the ups and the downs? Because they're going to come after you hard.
They are, absolutely. And I think that's faith. I mean, for me, if you do something like this, it has to be about something bigger than you, right? It has to be a calling, and it can't be about your own personal desires. And that really has been, I've seen things happen in this campaign that I can chalk up to nothing other than that. And that is what gets me through.
Well, listen, the full weight of everything I can do is behind you, and we wish you the best of luck. And if there's anything we can do more, let us know. But we're gonna keep pulling for you, and we'd love to chat with you again as the election gets closer, because there's gonna be a lot of things to talk about. And I'm just super excited about your future.
Thank you. Thank you. I am excited about Michigan's future. Thank you so much.
All right, Tudor. Thank you.